Welcome, and greetings to all. I am Shenlong Pendragon, the Lore Master. So, ladies and gentlemen, as always, a quick disclaimer here. The following is a non-profit video. I do not own any of the images or the story in this video. The credit for these all belong to their original sources. So, ladies and gentlemen, I know it's been about 7 months or so since my last video upload. I can only apologise. It has been an unbelievably busy time here in Japan for me. I haven't had a lot of time to do this, so hopefully I can find a bit more time now. But either way, here is the next video, and as you can see from the title, this is part 3 of the Great Battles series. And today I'm going to be doing a battle which really doesn't need any kind of introduction. This is the Battle of Thermopylae. So, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are not familiar with this battle, this took place between the Greeks and the Persians. Specifically, this is the battle best known for the 300 Spartans. However, there is a lot of misconceptions and, shall we say, romanticism when it comes to this particular battle. You typically often see the Spartans being depicted as these heroic, dashing warriors standing alone against overwhelming odds, and to an extent, yes, they were, but what a lot of people tend to forget is that they were not alone on this battlefield. It was not just 300 Spartans. There was actually a lot of Greeks present at this battle. And a lot of other people also tend to forget that this battle actually took part in tandem with another battle known as the Battle of Artemisium, which was a naval battle headed by Themistocles of Athens, whom a lot of you probably may know from the 300 movies. So, ladies and gentlemen, before I dive on into the meat of the Battle of Thermopylae itself, it's first important to know the backstory and the build-up to this battle because it is so iconic. The image that you're seeing here is a stone tablet depicting the Persian king Darius the First, also known as Darius the Great. This particular gentleman actually led the first invasion of Greece, which was unsuccessful, and I will very briefly go into that in a minute. This particular invasion, the first one I should say, wasn't just a war of conquest, but actually also a war of revenge. For you see, not long before the invasion took place, approximately a year or so beforehand, the Persians had to put down what's known as the Ionian Revolt, which was in fact instigated by Athens, the Greek city-state. The reason behind this is that Darius had originally demanded that the Greeks submit to him by offering earth and water, which was a symbolic gift to indicate that they are giving up their land. Now you have to bear in mind that the majority of Greece was not united. The Greeks were split up into individual city-states, and each one of these had their own governments, kings, etc. And they were not used to working together, they were not a coherent force, and they all considered themselves to be independent. And individually, they knew they could not defeat the Persian army. So the majority of these city-states did submit. Athens, however, did not. Instead, they put the Persian envoy on trial and then executed them, simply just for the audacity of demanding Athens' surrender. And very famously, however, Sparta also did not submit. And a lot of you who have seen the movies will note that the Spartans simply kicked, or you'll probably know the quote, "This is Sparta," where they kick the Persian envoy into a well. This actually did happen historically. The Spartans did indeed throw the Persian envoy into a well, basically thinking there's plenty of water and earth down that well, help yourselves, but we will not submit. So as you can imagine, Darius, with 2 of his envoys now dead, was not pleased. So he launched his campaign primarily to strike against the city of Athens first. Upon hearing that Darius was launching a war of revenge against them, Athens sent their own envoy to Sparta to request military aid. However, quite famously, Sparta could not aid them at this time. They were currently celebrating a festival known as the Carneae, in which Sparta cannot enter combat unless to defend its own borders. They did, however, promise military aid once the Carneae was over. However, it was obvious that Sparta would not get to the battlefield in time to aid Athens, so Athens had to stand alone with whatever allies it could gather against the initial Persian assault. The Persians landed their army at the battle, or rather I should say at the Bay of Marathon, which becomes now the Battle of Marathon. This was a decisive victory for the Athenians, who used superior tactics against the Persians. Rather than waiting for the Persians to land their entire force, the Greeks attacked first. However, the Persian army was completely overwhelming in number, and slowly throughout the course of the day, they pushed the Athenians back across the field, trying to give the time for their cavalry to deploy. This, however, was exactly what the Athenians wanted. As the Persians kept hitting them in the centre, this caused the Athenian ranks to bow out to the side. Soon, although the lines were thin, the Persians realised that they now had Athenians surrounding them on three sides. This allowed the Athenians to then launch into a shock tactics of repeated assault in waves, and eventually they ground down the Persian forces before they actually had a time to fully deploy all their troops. With his infantry now completely destroyed, Darius had no choice but to withdraw, especially as Sparta was supposedly sending reinforcements. So by the time the Spartans actually got to Marathon, they found there was actually nothing for them to do. The Athenians had already won, so they went home. Now, a lot of you will recognise the name Marathon and understand this as a term for running. This is because, very famously, the Athenians, after winning the battle, sent a runner back to Athens from Marathon. And the approximate distance, I think I'm right in saying from my old history lessons, the approximate distance from the battlefield to the city gates of Athens is approximately 26 miles. So this runner, after having fought in this battle, still in full armour, sprinted or ran all the way back home to Athens to deliver the news of the victory. And apparently, after he delivered this news, he collapsed dead from exhaustion. So in honour of this victory, the Athenians started doing the marathon run of this 26-mile run, and this now becomes the modern day marathons, where people continue to honour this tradition. So yeah, just a little backstory on where marathons come from. But the important point to take from this is that the first Persian invasion was absolutely smashed by the Athenians, and it was a really decisive blow against the Persian Empire. And Darius himself, although he did plot to launch a second campaign, never got the chance. He actually died before he had the chance to launch his second attack. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we are approaching the build-up, or the true build-up, to the Battle of Thermopylae itself. As I've already said, there was more than just 300 Spartans at the pass. The Greek forces actually numbered approximately 7,000, and their primary objective was to hold the pass of Thermopylae, also known as the Hot Gates, at all costs. The original Greek historians that documented the battle estimated the Greek casualties to be approximately 4,000. However, more modern and later sources believe that this was an overestimation and believe that the casualty number is more likely closer to 2,000. The exact number of this is unknown. One of the biggest misconceptions I've heard about the Persian forces in this battle is I've heard numerous times that the Persian numbers were close to 1 million. This is absolute rubbish. There's no way the Persians could have fielded a force of 1 million soldiers. They simply just logistically could not have done it. No, the sources cite that the Persian army that was mustered for this battle was between 100,000 and 300,000, with more likely between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers, which for the ancient world was a truly massive army. It was said that the Persian army that marched literally drank rivers dry, and with numbers like this, honestly, it's not hard to see why. That is a staggeringly large army for the time period. The primary objective of the Persian forces was to force a passage through to take Athens and can dominate that region of Greece before launching into a second phase of their campaign to take over the rest of Greece. The estimated casualty numbers for the Persian forces are not known exactly, as it was with the Greeks. However, the estimations number 20,000, which is, as you can imagine, a staggering number of casualties to take from a single battle. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here is a photograph of the Thermopylae region in modern-day Greece. Now, it is worth noting that this is not the exact battleground, however, it is fairly close. Now, you'll see from a lot of artwork, movies, and other depictions that the Greeks fought in a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea. It is worth noting that a lot of sources do say that the pass was significantly narrower in the ancient world than it is today. They believe that the sea has receded somewhat from the mountains. The source I was reading said that at one point they believed the road that you can see in the image marked the end of the original highway, if you will, or the original road that the Persians would have been using. How true this is, I don't know, but all I can say is that this is the general terrain of the battlefield to give you an idea of what it looks like. Again, obviously this is what it looks like in the modern era, and the battlefield will have definitely changed since the ancient world. I should also correct myself at this point and state earlier that I mentioned that during the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians requested aid from Sparta. Now, I don't have any specific historical sources to prove this. I do apologise. This is simply what I was taught when I was at school, and unfortunately I didn't read that source. So if I have made a mistake there, and if that is wrong, I do apologise. As I say, all I can do is just quote what I was taught when I was learning this in history class. So if I have made a mistake there, I do apologise, and if anyone does want to correct me in the comments saying, no, I've made a mistake at this point or at that point, then by all means, please do correct me. So, coming to the first day of the battle. The Persian army was led by Darius' son, Xerxes the First. Now, I did say that Darius by this point had died. This was primarily due to illness, for after the Athenians defeated the Persians at Marathon, there were a number of other revolts, and Darius actually died of illness en route to fight a revolt in Egypt, which at the time had been conquered by the Persian army. After putting down the revolt, Xerxes I returned home to the capital of the Persian Empire. I believe that may have been Babylon, however, I could be wrong. And then he began building up troops again to launch a second campaign against the Greeks. Now, once again, the Athenians requested aid from Sparta, and once again, I believe there was at least between 1 and 3 year difference between the Battle of Marathon and the Battle of Thermopylae, approximately. So once again, the Spartans were indeed honouring the festival of Carnair, and it could be very possible that the Persians had learned of this festival and decided to attack, knowing that due to their traditions and culture, the Spartans could not field their army. However, the king of Sparta, or I should say one of the kings of Sparta, decided the Persian assault was too big of a problem for Sparta to ignore and they should go to war. This is famously King Leonidas of Sparta. Now you'll note I said one of Sparta's kings. The reason for this is that Sparta was actually governed by two kings at this time. The first being the military king, essentially like the general of the city, and the second being a more domestic king who was in charge of the day-to-day running, the farming, the crops, the livestock, the water source, that kind of idea. So Sparta essentially had a military king and a domestic king. Leonidas was the military king at this time. However, as it was, he did have to go seek advice and aid from the oracle, as was tradition from whenever Sparta went to war. Now he was told that he should honour the Carnair and Sparta should not march to war. So Leonidas did just that. He did not march Sparta's entire army. Instead, knowing that he could not leave everything alone and fearing what would happen if Sparta did not march, he decided to go himself with a retinue of 300 elite soldiers. En route to Thermopylae, he met up with a number of other Greeks who felt similarly to him, a lot of them coming from the city of Thebes, and together they put up a defence. It was generally collectively accepted that as the most experienced soldier there and as the king of Sparta, that Leonidas should take command of the Greek forces. At the same time, Themistocles of Athens led the Athenian navy along with some naval allies to Artemisium to hold off the Persian navy. The general battle plan of the Persians was that the infantry would march along the coastline and make a beeline through the Hot Gates straight through the region and eventually take Athens, whereas the navy would blockade the Athenian port and help with the logistics of supplying the infantry, cavalry, and if needed, to allow the Persians to bypass any fortifications or any cities or any soldiers by the sea if they had to. However, I should also point out that while the navy did help to transport the Persian troops from Persia to Greece, this actually isn't how the bulk of the Persian forces crossed. They actually built a bridge of ships and laid a decking like a pontoon across the small gap which you see between Greece and Turkey. Now, not across the Aegean Sea. This is like quite a narrow strait they built it across. I can't for the life of me remember what the strait is actually called, but if you actually look at a map of Greece and Turkey, you can quite clearly see this narrow strait, and it was across there that the Persians built this bridge. Sorry about that little detour. So coming back to the battle itself. So the 7,000 Greeks took up position at Thermopylae, seeing this as tactically the best advantage they could get over the Persian numbers, and it absolutely was. When Xerxes arrived, he saw that the Greeks had dug themselves in deep and had started to recreate what's known as the Photian Wall. This wall was essentially like a little narrow wall at the narrowest point of the pass. So this was where the Greeks took up their positions. Now Xerxes knew that, being a relatively competent commander, Xerxes knew that he could not simply just smash his way through easily. So he decided to delay and see if his naval forces could come and simply just bypass the Greek blockade altogether. But as I said, the Greek navy was held up at Artemisium. This left Xerxes with two options. He could go back and try to find another route, or he could attack. For 5 days, the two armies stood off before actually beginning the offensives. Xerxes famously did send envoys to the Greeks to demand their surrender, pointing out their superior numbers. And this is where the famous quote, "Their arrows will block out the sun," and then the Spartans replied, "Good, we shall fight in the shade." Yes, this is an actual historical quote. So, eventually, after 5 days, with supplies starting to become a concern, Xerxes ordered the attack, simply because by this point he didn't really have much of a choice, he had to do something. As you can imagine, the Persians knew that to send in infantry directly would simply just be absolute madness. They would take very high casualties. So they began by sending 5,000 archers to try and weaken the Greek lines. Now the Greeks, as you can imagine, used the Phalanx Formation. The phalanx is a type of spear wall, or I should say a shield wall with spear formation. And as you can see from here, Greek soldiers, also known as hoplites, were equipped with large round shields which they used to protect themselves from the neck to the thigh. And the Persian archers proved ineffective against this formation, for the Greeks just used their shields to defend themselves. Obviously, yes, the Greeks will have taken some casualties from the bombardment, but pretty few, I'm afraid. It really was a complete ineffective tactic. The 5,000 archers were then followed by a wave of 10,000 Persian soldiers. This was then followed with a second wave of 10,000 soldiers. The Greeks held their formation and continued to fight using a tactic of defensive attack, counterattack, and then false retreats, followed by a second counterattack. This did not go well for the Persians, I'm afraid to say. They took heavy casualties, and they just simply could not get past the Greek phalanx formations. Enraged, Xerxes decided later on that day that he wanted to teach the Greeks a lesson, so he sent in his elite soldiers. Now, I should point out that the Persian army, much like the Greek army, was typically made of standing official soldiers who were essentially the regular army, and the rest were primarily militias. These elite soldiers were part of the standing army, and the modern day term for them is immortals. That is not the original Persian name. I don't know what the original Persian name is, but this is just what they've now become known as. And to be honest, they did not live up to the title of immortals. They did absolutely no better than the raw recruits and militias against the Greek phalanx. So, coming to the second day of the battle, it pretty much went exactly the same as the first. Xerxes sent in wave after wave of soldiers, hoping to break through the Greek defensives. However, his assumption that the Greek lines had been weakened from his initial assaults proved untrue. The phalanx formation seemed impregnable from frontal attacks, and the Greeks continued to hold out. Growing impatient, Xerxes tried to find a way around this formation. He really needed to get past them. He couldn't rely on his navy, which was held up in Artemisium, and if he stayed there any longer, he would take too many casualties to actually be able to take Athens. And again, he had logistical problems. Supplies were starting to run low. Now, this is where we start to see the battle turning. A lot of you will recognize the name Ephialtes. Ephialtes was originally born, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, in the Greek city Tracheus or Tracheus. Now, exactly how you pronounce that, I don't know. Someone please correct my pronunciation. I will just refer to him here as Ephialtes. Ephialtes was a Greek-born man. However, famously, he was supposedly either deformed in some way, or injured in some way, or in some way incapable of fighting, and he'd been denied the right to fight in the Greek forces, supposedly. Now, whether or not this is true or not, I don't know. This is just what some sources say. Either way, what pretty much every source agrees on is that Ephialtes was motivated by greed, and he was promised by Xerxes wealth beyond his imagination, women, wine, that kind of thing, if he helped the Persian forces achieve victory. Being convinced by Xerxes' promise, Ephialtes guided the Persian troops along a narrow, supposedly secret mountain pass. This mountain pass was likely not initially made by man. It was probably some kind of goat track or some sort of game trail made by wild animals. But either way, it was there, and this allowed the Persians to send troops to outflank the Greeks. Now, as you can imagine, this proved a big problem for the Greek forces. However, they did stay to fight. And I will go into the final steps here. Really, other than the betrayal of Ephialtes and the actual combat going pretty much the same as the first day, not a lot actually happened on the second day of the fighting. So I will now move on to the third and final day of the Battle of Thermopylae. So the third day of the Battle of Thermopylae, famously known as the Spartans' last stand. Yes, this is where the legend of the 300 Spartans dying does come from, and that is true. The 300 Spartans did stay, they did fight, and very unfortunately for them, they did die. But I will come into that in a minute. First, let's return to the outflanking Persian soldiers that Xerxes had sent along the mountain pass. Now, Leonidas was very well aware of the potential for being outflanked along this pass, and that the whole defensive strategy depended on the Persians not finding out. However, he had taken precautions in case the Persian soldiers did find the pass. A number of these Greek soldiers with Leonidas at Thermopylae were originally from Phocia, and these Phocian soldiers were used to guard the mountain pass. Now, I've actually heard several different sources from this. Some say that upon seeing the Phocians, upon seeing the Persian soldiers coming towards them, ran away back to their own city of Phocia to defend it, believing that they were coming along the pass to attack it. However, different sources say that they actually didn't flee to the city, but they did leave the pass they were guarding and retreat to a nearby hill to prepare for battle. Now that these Phocian guards had essentially withdrawn to try and take advantage of higher ground, the Persians didn't really need to bother with them. They were no longer in the way, they'd essentially retreated, and bar just having a very brief skirmish with them, the Persians mostly just ignored the Phocians, and that was essentially the battle for Phocia. It was no longer involved. However, a runner or messenger did manage to get to Leonidas and tell him that the Phocians had withdrawn and the Persians had found the pass and were now launching a flanking attack. So, on the night before the third day, Leonidas called a war council with all the commanders. They were outflanked, and they knew that if they stayed, they now would lose. They could not hold against the Persians on two fronts. So it was decided that the majority of the Greeks would leave to protect their homes and their own city-states. However, any who wished to stay could. In fact, there's some reports that say Leonidas actually ordered the Greeks to leave but a number of them strongly objected and insisted upon staying. So Leonidas ended up staying at the pass of Thermopylae with his own 300 Spartans, approximately 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and a number of Helots. Helots are essentially almost like pseudo-slaves, I should say. They were peasantry which mostly acted as servants and, in terms of battlefield, a bit like a militia. There are debates on exactly why these people all stayed, but regardless, they did stay. So as the battle dawned, the Greeks, rather than waiting for the Persians to hit them on two fronts, launched into an assault upon the advancing Persian forces at their front. This completely took the Persians by surprise, who were expecting the Greeks to hold their Phalanx Formation. Knowing that they couldn't win, the Greeks fought to the last, up until the point where their weapons were starting to break, and their armour and shields had essentially been crumpled, rent, and, to all intents and purposes, were destroyed. During this fighting, two of Xerxes' own brothers were actually killed by the Greek forces, and Leonidas himself was actually shot dead by a Persian archers in a volley of arrows. Both sides then viciously fought over Leonidas' body. The Greeks were unwilling to let the Persians have him. Eventually they managed to reclaim Leonidas' body from the Persian lines and retreated to a hill behind the Photian Wall to conduct their last stand. Now, the Thebans had taken very heavy casualties by this point, and they completely lost heart. They did no longer want to fight, and the majority of what was left of the Thebans surrendered. They walked down from the hill, the arms up, and initially the Persians started to attack them until they then realized, oh no, they're actually surrendering, and instead they essentially took them as war prisoners instead. The rest of the Greek forces decided to fight to the bitter end. Now, I would probably assume that, being simple peasants that had just been ordered to stay and fight, a number of the Helots probably would have surrendered with this Theban contingent, but exactly what the numbers of how many surrendered, I don't know. Eventually, rather than wasting more men in an attack, Xerxes told his archers to fire upon the Greek formation to weaken their lines and kill as many of them as possible before the final assault. And as you can imagine, the Greeks fought very bravely all day, but eventually they were all killed. Supposedly, the last man standing of the Greek army was the Spartan second in command, protecting the body of his king, until he too was finally killed. Supposedly, after the battle, Xerxes walked among the carnage and declared himself displeased. He wasn't happy it had taken 3 days for his army to finally force its way through the pass, and he was very unhappy about the casualties he had suffered. Understandably so. I mean, he's there on a campaign, and the first initial battle had resulted in nearly 20,000 casualties for his side. That's a huge number of soldiers to lose to a significantly inferior, well, I say inferior, what I technically mean is a significantly smaller force. Now, supposedly Xerxes, when he came across Leonidas' body, was so angered by the Spartan king that he ordered that Leonidas' head should be cut from the corpse and should be then displayed in Persia as a show of, we have won, we have conquered. This was actually very out of character for Xerxes. A lot of historical sources say that he was actually quite well-tempered, and generally he was meant to be quite a generous man to prisoners of war, and often treated his enemies with a great deal of respect. But we all have limits to our patience, and I'm afraid Leonidas had pushed Xerxes to the absolute extremity of his, and just in a moment of anger, this is what Xerxes decreed. Eventually, Leonidas' head, as well as the rest of his remains, were returned and given a proper burial in Sparta. I should point that out. Eventually, the Persians did return Leonidas' body to the Spartans, and he was given a proper funeral. The image that you're seeing here is actually a more modern memorial to the Greek soldiers that fought at the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, how close this monument actually is to the battleground and the battle site and stand on the final hill, I don't know. There is a smaller monument which supposedly stands on the actual site of the final last stand on the hill, and I will show you that in a couple of minutes. So as you can see from the results here, it really was ultimately a victory for the Persian Empire. Now, the word that you're seeing here, I always struggle to pronounce it, I'm afraid, but this is the actual official name of the Persian Empire. If anybody knows how to properly pronounce it, then please do comment down in the comment section down below. For fear of insulting people, I'm not even going to make the attempt at pronouncing this word. I always struggle with it, I'm afraid, which is why I just simply refer to them as the Persian Empire, which is the more, shall we say, the more layman's term for this particular force. But either way, it was a victory for the Persian Empire. Although not a decisive victory, it wasn't exactly a Pyrrhic either. I would probably more go so far as to say it was a valiant defeat for the Greeks, a heroic defeat for the Greeks, but it certainly was definitely a victory for the Persians. So, the aftermath of the battle eventually was that Xerxes continued to lead his forces into Greece and did manage to take and occupy much of the region, destroying villages and cities along the way, and he did eventually get to Athens and burn it to the ground. However, this was really just a symbolic victory burning Athens. It really did not gain Xerxes the victory that he was hoping for. And the reason for this comes back to Themistocles. Upon hearing that the Greeks had indeed lost at Thermopylae after very fierce fighting, Themistocles, who had managed to fight the Persian navy to a stalemate, decided, we've also taken heavy casualties and Athens is now exposed. Let's withdraw to help the city. So the Greek navy, or primarily the Athenian navy, withdrew back to Athens to evacuate the city, and they managed to evacuate the majority of the Athenian citizens to the island of Salamis, where once again they engaged the Persian navy, and this time the Greeks actually did manage to achieve a victory. The Persian navy was, after very fierce fighting, was eventually defeated at Salamis. Now that word had reached Xerxes of having lost his navy forces, he, again, being a competent commander, realized, I'm now in trouble. My infantry has my ground troops, my infantry and cavalry have taken significant casualties, and now with our naval forces destroyed, there's a good chance I could be trapped in Greece with no way home. And, again, supplies and logistics are a problem here. So, fearing that he would be cut off, Xerxes decided to take a large contingent back to Persia with him. However, as it often is with the ancient world, a lot of this contingent did die en route, primarily due to a lack of supplies and disease. As I said, logistics for this entire campaign was a massive problem, and an army of 100,000 to 150,000 is a very big army to feed and water. And you haven't just got the soldiers too, you've also got the horses, the servants, slaves, stable hands, grooms, commanders, and the general camp followers. It was a massive undertaking, this campaign, and Xerxes just did not have the logistical supply routes to take care of it now that his navy was defeated. So Xerxes did eventually get back to Persia. However, the majority of his forces that he took with him died en route home. Instead, he left a trusted general known as Mardonius to lead what was left of the Persian army to complete the conquest of Attica. Now, Attica is actually a region or a province within Greece, and this is the province of where Athens is. And essentially, this was the region that Xerxes did want to take. So Mardonius, or Mardonius, however it's pronounced, again being a skilled commander, knew the logistical problems. However, his king had given him an order, and the order was to maintain the foothold in Greece and secure the rest of Attica to allow for future campaigns and operations to conquer the rest of Greece. And Mardonius continued to fight. However, he eventually was defeated by a united Greek army, primarily led by, again, Athens, and I believe now that the Carneia had ended, Sparta finally fielded the rest of its army to avenge its king. And this army marched, and eventually the united Greek forces defeated the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. Now, Plataea is in fact, this was actually the second Battle of Plataea. The first Battle of Plataea was orchestrated by Xerxes himself during the campaign, and the city of Plataea was destroyed along with Athens. However, in the second battle, Xerxes by now had returned to Persia, and Mardonius was left alone to fight off the Greeks with what forces he had left. And it was an absolute stunning victory for the Greeks. Once again, as was typically the scene for this campaign, there was both a ground battle and a naval battle. The naval battle was the Battle of Mysail, and I do hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. It's Mysail or Mysail. So again, if I'm pronouncing this wrong, please do correct me in the comment section. And once again, the Persian navy was destroyed at this battle. So ultimately, the campaign was a resounding victory for the Greeks, but at heavy cost. So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I do apologise. I promised to show you an image showing the very small monument on the hill of the last stand. Unfortunately, I did look, but I couldn't find any good images of it. There are plenty of images online, however, if you do want to go have a look. I just couldn't find any that I was able to use here, so I do apologise about that. The Battle of Thermopylae, as I've already said, is incredibly iconic, and it's shown as one of the great battles which we see exemplars of heroism and self-sacrifice. Eventually, we come to a point between tensions, shall we say, where tensions between Athens and Sparta hit such a pitch that we eventually come to the Polynesian War, and I do hope I pronounced that correctly. This was a war fought within Greece, and Sparta did eventually win this war, however at great cost, and Athens did maintain its independence and did still stand after it. You probably have come across this war before if you enjoy reading about Greek history, or if you're a fan of Greek mythologies, or again, if you're just a fan of the Assassin's Creed games, you've probably come across this war before. Anyway, moving swiftly on from that, as we do know from history, Greek and Persian relations did result again into open warfare numerous times, even after the Battle of Thermopylae and the second invasion of Greece. And one of the most iconic characters in this history was a Macedonian king whom we all know as Alexander the Great, who would eventually go on to ultimately defeat the Persian Empire. If you would like me to do stories or any videos on Alexander the Great, please do let me know. I find the historical side of works for him and his campaigns to be absolutely fascinating. I mean, such a competent commander and such a king of such an impressive empire, which he actually did lead armies to and conquer up to the age of 32, in which case he did die, was absolutely incredible. I mean, to have achieved so much he did in such a short life was absolutely phenomenal, and yeah, I would love to do videos on him at some point in the future if you guys are interested. So please do let me know if that's something you would like. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of the video now. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I know it's been a long one, especially since I've been away for 7 months. I hope you have stuck with me, and if you have, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If you have any critiques, comments, if you've spotted any mistakes I've made, then again, by all means, please do point them out to me. I'd love to hear it. So again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I will now do my outro. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to like and subscribe for more lore, myths, legends, and stories. I am Shenlong Pendragon, and until next time, knowledge is power.